All right. And welcome back, guys, to Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hageman, and today we're doing a different kind of episode. So if you have been listening to the podcast for, I don't know, let's say since March or April, you may have heard there was an episode where I talked about getting back on track. And I went pretty deep into you need to get very clear about what got you off track to make any kind of movement forward, any kind of progress in identifying, okay, how do I prevent this from happening again? Or how do I minimize even the magnitude at which I fell off track? And I want to revisit this topic because it is one in the coaching realm. As a coach, and by the way, those of you who have booked consultations or booked coaching calls, given that you've listened to the podcast and you're like, okay, I'm fucking ready to finally take control of what I'm doing and get my program regimented. I want to make progress forward. I commend you. I commend you for letting it sink in and deciding that hey, this is who you want to be. And that's essentially what we're talking about today. Is being that person who can make mistakes, who can not be 100% on track, who can have the fuck ups, who can, even just make decisions and come out of it. And it's not this catastrophic thing. It's not like I binged or, I completely overdid it. It's that wasn't the best decision. So I'm not going to continue to do that again. Being able to recognize when you're not acting in accordance to your goals, the things you want. It sounds very straightforward. It sounds fundamental. It sounds like something that most people should be able to do, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people will make justifications, will rationalize why they behaved the way they did, why they made the decision they ended up making. And I think this is what in itself keeps you stuck, keeps you the most stuck. If you've never tried this, it feels really good to just take ownership over oh yeah, that wasn't the brightest idea. That wasn't in accordance to how I want to act because of said goals that I've set out to accomplish. And I think two things. Okay, I work with a lot of women. I work with men as well. What I tend to find is that there's a heavy degree of guilt, shame around admitting overages, specifically within female clients. There's so much shame around not being able to just suck it up and stay on plan. And you really it's a disservice to you. It's disservice to yourself. Because if you go into any kind of program, whether it, be a training program, nutrition program, diet, whatever, even if in a bulk, you can be non-adherent to a bulk or a build or whatever you want to call it, to expect perfection. Yes, that can be your plan A. You can be okay, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that I get the most out of this period. But realistically, I think that you have to have some grace for yourself, and you have to know that okay, there will be unknown unknowns. There will be things that you can't predict. And previously, in episode 10, which if you haven't listened to that, I would definitely go take a look, because that was probably, even though it views, it wasn't the most listened to episode at the time, just, early on into the podcast, first few months, a lot of people were yo, this is to a T, this is what I needed to hear. This has helped me so much in the practical application of where I'm struggling the most in my diet and being adherence. And that's where I feel this is a topic that even clients of mine who listen to the podcast, who are religious, just OGs, very much weekly, they're getting the notifications when the new one drops. They're still okay, I know how you feel about this. I know that you've talked about this, but I don't know how to take this concept, these principles, and apply it to myself. And that's where truly, I think this starts with working backwards. Okay. One, admitting that you were non-adherent, admitting that you fell off track. Sounds really fundamental, sounds very easy to do, and it should be pretty black and white if you have a program that you're supposed to be following. I'll never forget, I had a client, she checked in, former client, great girl. she checked in following macros and a meal plan, like a meal plan, but she knew the macros, was able to make substitutions. And it was like her first or second check-in. And in her subjective feedback, like under dietary deviations, it said, no. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, essentially in my, my athlete feedback sheet, like I have a column under objective data for dietary deviations. It's funny because some people are like, yo, like I swapped grapes for blueberries. Like, is that okay? Is that a deviation? I'm like, it's fucking fine. Don't report that. Don't waste your time. I'm talking about like you were off track. Like you did something that we agreed you weren't going to do. Or like generally it was known I was going to follow these macros or follow this meal plan or make, a combination of some of these sorts, and you didn't. And I remember she put like, no, like, so no deviation. So to me that like reads, I was adherent this week. And under her subjective feedback, which I have an athlete feedback section underneath the objective, all subjective. And I forget what section she put it under. Maybe it was like rate of change. It was like, how do you feel about your rate of change? No, it couldn't have been that. But okay, so in her subjective feedback, maybe it was just under like the athlete feedback, like general column. And she's like, adherence, well, I tracked most of the days, but wasn't completely on track. Was I adherent? I don't know. And I was like, wait, what? How do you not know? Because this should be as simple as like a yes or no. Like I was adherent or I'm not. Like if you have target numbers, and for clients, like I do give them like laxity with saying like, hey, if you're within 5 grams of, what we're hitting for macros, I mean like over or under, like, yes, you need to adhere to the total calories, but it does average out. Like it's not the end of the world if you were 5 grams over literally on all the calories or on all the macronutrient, components profiles. And oh no, she didn't say I don't know, she said who knows. I'm like, you fucking know, you're the only one who knows. Like if anyone knows if you're adherent, it is you. And that's what I want to hammer home right now. You absolutely know if you're adherent or not. There are aspects of adherence that truly are unintentional. Like it is not a part of, like you're not scheming as like a way to, get around and get more food into your diet if you're in fat loss phase, or in the case you're building, it's not a way for you to eat more or less than you intended to, but quite simply, like you don't realize that you're not on track. That's not what I'm talking about. Unintentional non-adherence, that can be an accident. It should not be a repeated thing, and it shouldn't be indefinitely. Granted, I've been tracking macros. I'm 29 years old. I've been tracking macros since I was 15. It has been a long ride, and I still make oopsies. I still fuck it up. So, I mean, like, this is not like, hey, the longer you do it, like, yes, it should get easier, and you should likely make less mistakes. You certainly shouldn't continue to make repeated mistakes, like again and again. But what I will say is that the mistakes can still happen. If you are repeating those same mistakes, I begin to question, like, is that really unintentional or is that just a cop-out? When I'm talking about adherence, though, I mean, like, you can distill this down to, if you have macronutrient targets, which I'm a very big fan of giving my clients the targets in addition to the meal plan. So even clients who are like, hey, I want to follow a meal plan, I don't give a shit about the macros, I'm still like, okay, well, like you don't need to give a shit about the macros, sure, follow the meal plan, but there's going to be a time. There's going to be a time where you run out of a certain food. There's going to be a time where you're running behind, and like you need to makeshift some like double meal, or maybe you like do overeat in one meal, or you eat out later in the day and then we have to make modifications. It's kind of a sneaky way to trick you into building agency and autonomy over your food choices. Like that's really where it comes from. But I include the macros so that there's an understanding, like, hey, you can't just swap out. Like if I give you chicken, rice, and a vegetable, like it's just a very simple meal. Like this isn't one of those things you can just swap it out for a crumble cookie. And I am speaking from like a specific client I'm thinking of this past week who like girl, I'm like, you're not adherent. You want to use drugs. And at this point, like, I mean, I've told you, like, hey, you don't have the green light from me until you get your shit together on the back end. And like, that's the sad part is like, a lot of people think like, oh, I'm just going to hire Corey and she's going to hook me up with the source. She's going to give me the dose. She's going to make sure I don't do anything dumb. No. Like, frankly, I'm going to talk you out of it, and I'm going to not recommend you start drugs if, just from a fundamental standpoint on the programming side, you are not consistent, you are not adherent, you're not training hard enough. I mean, like, yeah, you add the drugs in, and sure, it's not going to do much. I mean, it will do something, but frankly, it's really only going to act like a compensation. It's going to do very little in terms of enhancing the current progress that you're having, because frankly, you're not having that much progress. So originally in episode 10, which I feel like I structured it in a decent fashion. If you listen now, it's probably like super rambly compared to the structure that I've been having. I've been trying to adhere to the last several months. But what I really wanted to focus on was when these behaviors of non-adherence, when these bouts of non-adherence are actually occurring. Very simply, are they occurring in your home or outside of your home? This is a good way to differentiate what the solution, what the intervention might actually be. If these are primarily occurring in your home, well, then we have to ask, okay, is it because you have access to these like junk foods, these highly palatable foods, or foods that frankly you're just like, okay, well, it's technically a whole food, so it doesn't matter how much I eat on it. And even within that, okay, like, are you eating small amounts of high calorie foods, or are you eating large amounts of seemingly low calorie foods, but you're going over repeatedly enough and in a magnitude that ultimately is adding up? So it's like completely taking you out of a deficit and even potentially putting you in a surplus. And like, let's just stick with this idea of like, okay, it's happening in home, on your home turf. Is it happening when your spouse is around, or is it happening when it's just you on your own? Is it happening during like normal meal setting timing, like breakfast, lunch, dinner, or is it happening outside of normal standard meal times? Is it happening late at night or kind of in between meals? You just like find yourself like drifting into the kitchen. You're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I guess I will eat. And none of this is meant to sound demeaning, because I mean, a lot of the examples I'm pulling from are directly from experiences I've had. So please know that like, there's a lot of shame around admitting non-adherence. But I swear to you, if you start taking ownership, if you start logging and just like, I don't know, staring it directly in the face and just like, yeah, you know what? This is the issue. It's every time that I do this behavior, or I do these series of behaviors, that I can objectively say like, this is pulling me off track. I think those lack of results, or the, diminished results that, you feel entitled to get, I think it's going to make a lot more sense. And again, for me, it made a lot more sense when I was finally able to say like, okay, I can trace this back to this behavior. Because if you look at like a day, okay, like, I mean, you're waking up, you're going to sleep, you're only up for, let's say, 15 hours on average. Like, some people less, some people more. If you're up 20 hours, okay, sick, like you get no sleep. But that's collectively when the behavior, it's not happening when you're sleeping. It's happening when you're awake, when you have access to food. And it's like, if you were to just not eat, I mean, like, some of y'all can probably think to times where you had to do a fast, whether it was because like medical procedure, or I don't know, you fasted and it was like very much an intentional fast. Okay, you didn't eat. Yeah, it was annoying, but it was very much plausible. Like, it didn't hurt you to do that. It may have been uncomfortable. Like, it's during those waking hours that something is throwing you off. And typically when it comes to fat loss, this comes from the fact of like, you are doing something that you're not supposed to do. You're doing something that is negating that restriction from earlier in the day, or that you'll need to enforce later in the day. So walking this backwards, okay, does it happen when you're alone or around, people in your house, family members. Okay, now, does it happen out of an emotion? Does it happen because you're like, I'm feeling stressed, so I'm going into the kitchen and I'm mitigating this stress because I feel shitty. I have a client who currently, she was telling me, like, in her place of work, she's like, I really struggle with the comments that are made. And like, I get it. I get it. Hey, in nursing school, like, it was every fucking day, whether I brought lunch, whether I ate out, there were always comments. Like, and it typically wasn't a single comment either. It was multiple people. It was, if I had food in my hand, it was either, hey, like, what are you eating? Why are you eating that? Oh, you're eating that to lose weight. So it was either questions like asking for more information around like justifying my food behavior, or just assumptions, just blanket assumptions. And trust me, when I ate junk food, when I ate food that was like not on plan or self-made, it was very much like, ooh, like someone's being bad. Like it was, and at a certain point, I think pretty early on, like I became like just accustomed to this. I'm like, yeah, it's annoying, but like whatever. Like I can either be annoyed about it and then like I can ruin the 20-minute break I have between like classes, or I can just get over it. I can just be like, hey, this comes from ignorance. And with this client, like she's fairly new client, so I mean, like she's just being open and honest. She's like, hey, it's a struggle because the profession I'm in, like, it's very competitive, and like I do have to be around the same colleagues again, like, repeatedly at lunchtime. And if they order in, there's a comment, and if, I do eat with them, there's a comment, and it makes it really hard to be adherent. It's like, okay, so is this happening in response to something? Is there a triggering, an activating, I guess, a triggering behavior, activation of some sort that's now making you want to react by overconsuming? When you actually overconsume, are you able to stop yourself? Or is it a matter of I eat until I feel like shit, until I feel bad? I eat so much to the point that I feel uncomfortable even. If it's these things, like the more specific you can be around like building this clear picture around what is going on, the better. And like, I understand it. Like, this is not like representative of someone's, truest discipline, and it's certainly not representative of your value. This is a very vulnerable thing to share, but I think like with my clients, this is something that I feel like the sooner we can peel back these layers and get really clear on like, why is this happening and to what degree is it happening, the better we can be about like finding that intervention. And on the other end of the spectrum, let's say it's not a reactionary, it's not like emotionally driven. It's like, I was bored and it was around and I didn't say no. Okay, so like, do we categorize this as lazy, or do we just say like, hey, like you don't have that discipline, that willpower, your goal rooted in so like deeply that when the opportunity presents itself, you're going to waver? Okay, well then we need to have a stronger why. We need to have a consequence. We need to have something. And I don't mean like a consequence on the person. I just mean like mentally there needs to be some kind of negative that like, that goes off in your mind that you're like, hey, if I do this, this will happen. Because that's typically what I see is the differentiating factors. Like for certain clients, they're like, yo, this girl brought in food and immediately I was like, no, I can't eat that because I'm committed to getting my pro card. Like, I mean, just like so quickly goes to like, this little thing happened. And then I was like, oh, the audacity. And then immediately like is tying it to like that overarching goal. And that's a real example from this past week. But literally like, some people, they just immediately jump, like the bouncing ball just goes so far. And for others, they don't even connect. They don't even think like, okay, you go out to eat and your spouse orders something and then that makes you want to order something. And yeah, I don't know, maybe they bring out the wrong dish and you're like, oh, fuck it. And like, you don't even think to like, hey, how is this going to affect my weigh-in? And it's like being able to have the foresight to, one, make the decision that you're going to do what you want to do, what you've decided now you're going to do, making that decision, deciding, okay, I'm going to be an active participant. Like I am actually involved in this decision making. I'm not passively going along with it. That is a huge, huge aspect of adherence. Because when you break this down, I mean, there are going to be moments that you feel very tempted. There's going to be moments where it's very difficult, where hunger is low, hunger is high. When hunger is low, adherence should be higher. When hunger is high, when sleep is low, maybe you're under a lot of stress. Maybe you have people around you that are encouraging you, that are like, hey, you've no reason. You look great. You've lost so much weight already. Why not just give in? And you have all of the external like pushes and I guess really incentives to be non-adherent. And that's where there are clients that I'm like, hey, like, this is where I want you to, you're at a point where I want you to exercise that agency. Like, if it's something you want to do, like, I want you to make the decision that ultimately you're okay with. And if it means that you come back a little bit fatter or you've gained weight because you've made repeated decisions of being non-adherent while we're in a fat loss phase, well, then it's like, okay, what we're compromising then is progress. And if you're okay with that, then I'm on board with it too. Really, what we need to do is make sure that whatever decision that you do make, that you still stand by that after the fact. Like, after the fact, you should still be like, well, yeah, even if like you're like, I wouldn't do it again, but I did make that decision. I understand why. It was something that at the time I very much wanted to do. Now, I think with time, I think you get better at deciding and really picking the times you want to overindulge or you want to be, a little off plan. I think with the experience of reflecting on those bouts of non-adherence, I think that ultimately is what's going to allow you to determine, like, hey, in the future, when I'm faced with the same option, whether it be like desserts or like you're going out to eat and they bring like bread or like chips out and it's like, okay, well, like this isn't something I actively ordered, but now I have the opportunity to eat it. It's like, well, you shouldn't have to go through that indefinitely, like the entire time that I don't know, the entirety of your life in which you're trying to modify your body composition, which hopefully you're not doing the entirety of your life. But eventually it should become very clear, like, hey, based on the phase that I'm in, based on the goals I have, this is or isn't a behavior that is in line with how I want to feel afterwards. And I think sometimes it can be as simple as that, is tracing it back to how do I want to feel afterwards. And if you listen to the episode I had regarding like staying on track while you're traveling, very, very heavily emphasized that like you really have to have so much foresight and think about like, okay, do I want to come back? Do I want to be like afraid to get on the scale? Do I want to be anxious when I go to do my check-in photos or my measurements? Because if you're nonchalant, if you're indifferent either way, and you're like, you know what, this trip is really, it's going to be luxe, it's going to be enjoyable, and I'm just going to, clean up the collateral after the fact. Okay. But that still needs to be the energy that you carry afterwards when you come back. And typically where I see a lot of people, they don't realize how this is going to surface is once they come back, they forget that they made those conscious decisions. They made these decisions that, ultimately they weren't in line with their goals. So now in turn, they're motivated to compensate, to undo the behavior. And I really think if you can catch that behavior before it happens and again, be that active participant and decide like, is this how I want to feel? Do I want to have to compensate? Do I want to have to do a lot of makeup work? This is ultimately what has stemmed really laid the foundation for me, like in contest preps as well as fat loss phases, is I'm like, I don't want to have a lot of makeup work. I don't want to be inefficient. I don't want to take 2 steps forward, take 1 step back every 5th step. I would like it to be as efficient as possible. I'd like to be in a position where I know that like the suffering or the discomfort or the amount of like suck that I have to go through to achieve my goal is absolutely the minimum amount needed to achieve the goal. Yes, there's going to be some of it. There's going to be some discomfort, but I don't want to ever be in that position where I'm suffering and I'm like, you were in control of this. Like, you are absolutely the reason that this is happening, and the reason that you're having to do this over again, it's because you made a decision that was absolutely avoidable. So when we start breaking down like what adherence actually is, I mean, think about it. Like, it is your ability, it is the ability of some form of matter, material to adhere to, like the actual adhesion to a different thing, a different form of matter. Now, if we're talking about in the medical setting, in the clinical setting, I mean, typically this is referring to someone's medication regimen and whether or not they are following it per what was agreed upon. So very much, I mean, even in the clinical setting, there are a lot of protocols that are given, prescribed, that are related to diet and behavior modifications. And within the coaching space, within my experience, I think a lot of people, they unintentionally get by on there being very like ambiguous ideas, definitions even of what adherence to the plan is. And this is why I think that a lot of people, a lot of coaches, a lot of like trainers will just give a blanket like meal plan without giving the context of macronutrients. They'll just say like, hey, if you follow this, like this is on plan. And if you're off the meal plan, then that in itself is demonstrating that you are non-adherent. And one of the reasons that I don't love that, I mean, like, even though it's extremely objective, that puts people in a position where any deviation, big or small, just not being on plan, okay, that is registering in their mind as I am non-adherent. I was off track, where I do think that there's some gray area. And I think specifically when we're talking about making swaps within like similar macronutrient compositions, I think that becomes very reasonable and is not something that I even, denote as like, okay, well, this is someone being non-adherent. Now, where this gets taken out of context and people like really, I guess, like still playing within the constraints of like, well, I'm technically adherent, which I've seen time and time again with clients, is the individuals are like, hey, like if you're responsible with your macros and you were hitting similar types of compositions, like I'm okay with you to make substitutions. The difference lies in the fact of that food selection. So I'll tell you a story. Like I have a client right now who, in contest prep, someone I've worked with for quite a bit of time, we've gone through preps where I've been very rigid with her meal plan. I've been like, hey, like I need you to follow this to a T. And this has happened after bouts of fat loss where, let's just say, like we weren't seeing the results that we were hoping for, despite her being on very low calories. And within that, I mean, like there were discussions, there were, hey, let's unpack, like, can you show me your chronometer? Can you show me like the foods that are making up your meals every day? I mean, like we found, like going through her nutrition diary, of her food diary, I was like, okay, so you're having like chocolate, like pretty much 3 of your 6 meals a day. Like, to a certain extent, it's like, yeah, like I get you want to keep it flexible. You want to make these foods that, or these meals encompass foods that you enjoy. But at a certain point, I'm like, yo, like you're super like petite, like you're a very small individual, and 400 to 500 calories are coming from just chocolate. Like we have to look at the effects on performance and how this also is going to play a role in satiety as you get leaner and you get closer to the show. And this is where, being someone that like I've flexible dieted for majority of my career, like I've been on rigid meal plans, but I'll say that like I've done the best. I've been my most adherence with having some kind of understanding that flexibility is allotted. Like that's completely okay. That does not mean that I'm being reckless or I'm being off track. And I think this really comes down to having the responsibility of, making decisions around food selection when you have that flexibility, when you're in a state of low energy availability, that support performance. And this can be too much of a responsibility because, I mean, like as hunger begins to go up, as cravings begin to set in, like this can absolutely be something that you struggle with, and you feel like, well, it's been this long since I've had a cheat meal, or it's been this long since I've had this kind of food. So what's a little bit going to hurt? And it's not to say that that little bit is in itself going to hurt, but it's a matter of like how many of these decisions, how many of these allotments then have deleterious effects over to whether or not you are even in a deficit. And yes, there are going to be people that hear this that are like, okay, well, if it matches calorie for calorie, if it matches from a macronutrient profile standpoint, what's the big deal? Okay, yes, but if it's not of the same kind of nutrition profile, if we're missing out on the micronutrients and vitamins and minerals, that's where I think a lot of people underestimate how much of a role that's going to make in their performance, in their overall well-being. And I think the two that probably play the biggest role in non-adherence. Number one being buy-in. Now, buy-in is multifaceted. It's something that, you know, out the gate, I think you need to establish with the client. I mean, as the client, I think you need to have in, if you're not getting a huge, like massive surge in buy-in with a new program, I mean, like, sure, like a week, okay, give it a little bit of time. I don't expect that to happen in the course of like 1 or 2 days, but I do want to say, like, the first week, second week, this is why I put people in the kind of deficits that I do. They're not extreme deficits, but they're more aggressive than someone who's like, hey, I still want to live my life. And like, you're definitely going to have to work for it. You're definitely going to have to be a little bit uncomfortable. And frankly, that is what fat loss is going to entail, especially if you're someone who is already low-ish body fat, especially if you're someone who has already found a lot of ease with achieving what they've achieved thus far from a physique standpoint. If you are seeking to get to a further point in fitness, let's just say a lower body fat percentage, a body fat percentage that you've never been to, this more than likely will require that you reach new levels of discomfort that you've never experienced before. Really where I see the benefit of having someone go from, even if it is like, you know, they're starting at 2,000 calories going down to 1,400, it's like, okay, that in itself is more than enough to put you in a position where you go to check in after 1 week of being on plan, you will see that weight has come off. Like, you are now easily in a 600 calorie deficit. And if you're aiming to lose 1 to 1.5 pounds per week, this in combination with a very mild amount of output, so structured cardio or step count, this in itself will make it to where when you go to check in, it's like, yeah, okay, like this was a little aggressive, but you're going to complete that week knowing like it happened exactly as you said it was going to. You lost a pound, pound and a half, whatever we agreed upon. That in itself should give you enough motivation to endure some of that discomfort that you're experiencing. Now, I think where adherence falls short is when initially, you know, you go into a plan that, you know, is there ever really any certainty that it's going to work until you execute it? I think for a lot of people, they assume that it's not going to work. I mean, most people that I speak with, they come to me, they're like, I've tried everything under the sun. I've tried different fad diets. I've tried carb cycling. I've tried meal plans. It doesn't work for me. So going into the plan, like, I expect buy-in to be low, but what makes it that much worse, what makes adherence dwindle very early on into a diet is having that first week or two, you go in and you're like, okay, like I made a complete 180 with my habits, with my behaviors, and yet you go to do your check-in and nothing came off. And I know I'm speaking specifically about a fat loss phase, whereas like with build, quite the opposite is true, is that like we're not expecting a lot to change when you're trying to grow. That actually is a good thing, is like we're hoping that we don't see any kind of regression of the physique as we move food up, as we bring cardio down. Now, the second biggest thing that I think really deters adherence is the environment. And truly, I think like more often than not, the environmental factors, like these are absolutely things that are within your control, yet there is this fixed belief that you have no control or you have very little control over the environment that you're in. So I think first and foremost, creating an environment that helps you execute on habits that bring you closer to your goal. And this doesn't have to be like the example I used earlier where it's like, oh, like, okay, I don't want to have this dessert or this cupcake or whatever because I want to get my pro card. I mean, that's a very big and very quick jump that client's making. This can be as simple as, hey, I don't want to indulge because I want to be on track today. I don't want to go to bed knowing that I was off track. And I think when you start to build those habits and really those patterns of thinking about, okay, if my environment is affected and there is something completely out of my control in the case of someone offering me a food or there being a food that now I have access to that I didn't expect, this is a great opportunity to build those pathways, those mental pathways where you're like, yes, I could have this food. I have access to this food and it's very reasonable. And if I have a small amount, I don't think anyone would bat an eye. Yet I don't want to because of X, Y, Z. I think that's where a lot of people tend to assume like, okay, I can't have this because I'm fat. I can't have this because I need to lose weight. And that end, that, what are we talking about? That suffix of that statement really is very sad, but also is a deterrent for being adherent in the future, because it's very negative. It's very built into this idea that I can't do something and insert some statement revolving around I'm not valuable enough or I don't deserve to do something. Whereas I think if we completely shift that perspective to, no, I don't want to, like, I have, like, even just saying like I can't versus I don't want to, literally that in itself, like, you're going from a restriction to now decision making, like agency in your decisions. This is something that I found to be paramount in my ability to completely shift how I view dieting, even how I view building. And when you think about it, it also opens up this door, because I mean, like, when you're talking about other people who are encouraging you, and I mean, like, it doesn't come from a bad place. It's not like people are ever like, yeah, here, have this so you fuck off on your diet, so you gain weight, so you don't have a good check-in this week. People don't do that. They're like, hey, enjoy this because it's delicious. Hey, have some of this. Hey, you should try this. I made this. Whatever. When people are encouraging you to indulge, it doesn't typically come from a negative place. And usually when you say I can't, it evokes this sense of like, oh, yes, you can. Like, there's that compensation then from the other party that's like, well, of course you can. Like, you look great. And then there's justification and there's rationalization, because again, that person is typically trying to make you feel better. And this is absolutely going to be the case for some of you going home for the holidays right now. You're going to be in the like this exact setting where literally you are going to tell someone like, oh, I can't have any of that, or I'm okay, I don't want any of that. And they're going to take that as them needing to justify why you should have some of that. Now, if you take that framework, or even like that phrase, and you just say, no, that's okay, I don't want any. Not only are you communicating like, hey, like, I appreciate it. Like, I mean, you're kind of saying that in a way, like, respectfully declining. That's what you're turning that statement into, rather than essentially telling them like, I'm not allowed to, as in it's not up to me, it's up to this other entity, whether that be my coach or in this case my diet. So another common one I get is specifically going out to dinner with your partners. So like, maybe they're not on diet, or they're, in a phase of life where they're a little looser with their food reporting, or not reporting food whatsoever. Okay, well, as much as I want to say like, yeah, you should be able to go have the free meal, you can absolutely do that. But realistically, this is where a lot of people undo progress earlier in the week. So it's like you have to establish like that trade-off. Having an untracked meal, having a cheat meal can be completely adherent and a part of your weekly plan. It's not to say you have to go completely without untracked meals throughout the entirety of your fat loss phase. I've done it this way. I've done it with the cheat meals every single week. I know what I prefer given the specific goal at hand. I can tell you in a contest prep, that isn't something that I really find practical for me, because it does mess with my progress on a weekly basis. And frankly, I don't get to enjoy those meals nearly as much as I would otherwise. When we're talking about a fat loss phase where there's not a strict deadline, and perhaps there's a little more flexibility with the amount of weight that I want to pull off, this is a time where it absolutely would make sense, and I would say it's even indicated to have that luxury to go out and even practice the skill of portion control and making decisions around food that are technically untracked. I think when you begin to really peel back the layers of what drives adherence, I think it can be a form of self-sabotage. I think it can be rooted in this belief that, well, this diet isn't going to work anyway, so it doesn't matter whether I'm on track or not. And I think that's a real disservice to yourself, especially if this is something that you've been struggling with your entire life. Every act that you take, every decision that you make is because you're getting something that you want, even in the cases where you're not acting. Now, if you can identify, okay, what is being non-adherent? What is that doing for me? What kind of relief is that providing? You can get closer to finding that intervention. You can get closer to finding essentially the underlying reason to why non-adherence is a persistent issue for you. So before we go, last thing I want to leave you with, I get it. there is some comfort that comes from deviating from your plan. And in small bouts, maybe it is realistic. Maybe that's where you have the untracked meals built in, where it gives you, really a lack of rigidity and it gives you a break from being completely adherent all week. Maybe that's helpful. Maybe that facilitates better adherence the following week. It's completely fine. And I think for some people it is indicated. However, I would caution you whether or not you are using these brief bouts of non adherence and whether they are actually facilitating better outcomes in the long run or if they're slowing down your progress. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.